The first sensation to return was silence, though it was not a void. It carried a density, a weight. A silence born not of absence, but of waiting. My consciousness surged upward through strata of ancient thought and decayed memory, tethered to a body I had not inhabited in 1,000 years. It was an eternity and a blink, a paradox I no longer found perplexing. The stasis chamber's locks released with a reluctant hiss, like a sigh from the tomb world itself. My form stirred within the confinement of alloy and bone. The sensation of movement returned, and I stepped out onto the deck of my flagship, the Graveheart. The ship, a monolithic Necrotic construct, was the pinnacle of my engineering, both a weapon of conquest and a sanctuary for my unholy work. Its design fused Gothic architecture with alien precision, its very core imbued with the necrotic energy harvested by the Mortis engine. Below the planet's crust lay the Mortis engine itself, an arcane construct of my creation. It was no mere machine. It was a living mechanism, a fusion of forbidden science and necromantic will. Through it, I would raise fleets and armies from the wreckage of the galaxy's chaos, each ship and soldier imbued with perfect, unyielding obedience. Together, the Graveheart and the Mortis engine formed the twin pillars of my inevitable dominion. The Graveheart had slept with me, its systems dormant, its corridors darkened. Now, as I emerged, the ship awoke. My staff, a conduit of necrotic energy and machine logic, rested in a secure cradle before me. Its touch was familiar, as though the millennia that had passed were but a fleeting moment in the chronicle of my existence. Through the bridge's central viewport, Calderis 9 spread out below, a world gutted by time. Its surface, once bristling with life and industry, was a wasteland of wars and broken monuments. Towering spires of metal jutted into the planet's murky atmosphere, remnants of the battles that had scarred its crust. This was no mere ruin, it was a graveyard, and deep within its marrow, I sensed the Mortis engine. I strode forward. My mind was still calibrating, reconciling the fractured fragments of my last memories. The war, the betrayal, the chaos of the living. Humanity, in its hubris, had once spread across this galaxy, an infection creeping into every crevice of creation. Their empires rose and fell, each cycle more chaotic and unsustainable than the last. I had sought to impose order, to bring them the unity of death, but their resistance had driven me to retreat, to slumber. I turned my gaze inward. Systems within my body reactivated in sequence. Arcane sigils flared across my vision. The Mortis engine, my ultimate creation, stirred in response. I could feel it beneath Calderis 9's surface, its presence thrumming with the necrotic energy within me. It was a fusion of machine logic and the forbidden arts of death. Together, we had once bent armies to our will. Together, we would do so again. The ship's systems responded, a chorus of fragmented machine speak. Data scrolled across my vision. Integrity at 89%, power reserves at critical but sufficient levels. It was enough. The Graveheart had weathered the passage of centuries better than I had expected. I descended to the planet's surface alone, trusting the Graveheart to remain dormant above Calderis 9. As I emerged from my transport, desolation enveloped me. Wind laden with metallic dust lashed at my robes. The spires of wreckage loomed, skeletal fingers reaching toward a perpetually overcast sky. In their shadows I saw what remained of the planet's former inhabitants, corpses petrified by time, frozen in postures of despair or defiance. This place had been a battlefield once, and it had served its purpose well. Beneath my feet, the Mortis engine awaited, dormant but intact. I made my way to the site where it had been buried, a cavern carved into the heart of the planet's crust. My staff illuminated the path ahead, casting an unholy glow on walls lined with ossified remains. The architecture was not human. It was older, far older than my kind. It had been here long before I had repurposed it for my needs. When I reached the chamber, I paused. The Mortis engine was before me as I remembered it, an immense construct of spiraling black metal and organic surfaces. Its central core was a nexus of energy, glowing with the trapped souls of countless dead. Arcane runes glimmered across its surface, dormant but unyielding. I regarded it with something akin to reverence. This was no mere machine. It was a will made manifest, a nexus of purpose in a galaxy adrift in chaos. The activation process was swift. My staff interfaced with the Mortis engine, the runes flaring to life as its ancient systems roared awake. The forge consumed the ambient necrotic energy of the planet, drawing it into itself, feeding its insatiable hunger. Above, I knew what was happening without needing to see. Across the surface of Calderis 9, the wreckage of ancient warships began to stir. Hulls of rusted steel and shattered alloys groaned as they were pulled together by unseen forces. The Mortis engine stitched them into new forms, grotesque yet precise. Metal fused with bone, engines reignited with necrotic fire, and weapons systems roared to life with deadly purpose. The fleet I had envisioned so long ago was rising once more. I ascended to the surface to witness the culmination of my efforts. The horizon was filled with movement, the newly reanimated ships lifting into the sky, their silhouettes blotting out the dim light of Calderis 9's star. Their forms were crude yet functional, efficiency over elegance. I observed them with a sense of detached satisfaction. "My instruments of inevitability," I intoned, the words laced with contempt. These constructs would serve their purpose well, but they were merely tools. The galaxy I was to reclaim required not the imperfection of living minds, but the unity of the dead. The first test of the fleet came swiftly. As the Armada left Calderis 9's orbit, it encountered a derelict colony ship drifting in the system's outer reaches. The ship was a relic, a rusting hulk that had once carried thousands. Its systems were barely functional, its engines sputtering with failing power. Through the Graveheart scanners, I observed its crew, human, ragged, and desperate. They had survived here for generations, eking out a meager existence amidst the ruins of their ancestors' ambition. I issued no warning, no demand for surrender. Such gestures were the indulgences of the living. The reanimated fleet engaged the colony ship. Necrotic energy lanced through the void, breaching its hull in seconds. The survivors attempted to flee, launching escape pods into the darkness, but I was thorough. My fleet captured the pods, their occupants rendered into components for the Mortis engine. As the wreckage of the colony ship drifted through the void, I reflected on the scene. Their existence had been an aberration, a flickering light in the darkness, fragile and fleeting. Now, they had been repurposed, their chaos extinguished, and their energy added to the growing power of my Armada. I returned to the bridge of the Graveheart, standing once more before the central viewport. The newly reanimated fleet gathered around me, their forms ominous against the backdrop of stars. I considered the galaxy that lay before me, fractured and decayed, a hollow echo of what it had once been. Humanity's disunity and arrogance had led them here, to the edge of extinction. Now I would finish what they had begun. The Mortis engine stirred within my mind, a reassuring presence, its hunger aligning with my purpose. My next targets would be chosen with precision, their destruction inevitable. The galaxy would know order, not through negotiation or coexistence, but through the unyielding will of death. I allowed myself a final moment of reflection, the silence of the bridge enveloping me. Life was entropy, chaos, and decay. Death was order, unity, and purpose. As I gazed into the void, I felt no doubt, no hesitation. The void is vast, yet it is never truly empty. In every sector my fleet traverses, we uncover remnants of humanity's folly. Derelict stations circling dead stars, abandoned colonies choked by the regrowth of alien flora, battlefields still reverberating with the distant echoes of war. My Armada moves through this wasteland with the inevitability of an avalanche, silent but unyielding. Each step in my campaign is another turn of the wheel, grinding the fractured leftovers of humanity into the raw material of my design. From the bridge of the Graveheart, I oversee it all. My new fleet, raised from the husks of Calderis 9, has grown in number and strength. Each engagement, no matter how minor, adds to the Mortis engine armada. The once derelict vessels now glide through the void with macabre grace, their reanimated hulls glinting the dim light of distant stars. I find their symmetry satisfying, their silence calming. They are pure instruments, stripped of ego, ambition, or fear, qualities that doomed their former masters. Our first major target lies within the Velan Expanse, a region once rich with human colonies and trade routes. Now, it is a network of decaying star systems, its wealth plundered during humanity's descent into chaos. The Mortis engine has guided me here. Its hunger for energy for souls grows with every victory, and the Velan Expanse holds vast reserves of both. My initial scans reveal several viable targets: isolated outposts, graveyard worlds littered with derelict ships, and most intriguingly, an active military installation clinging to the edge of a black hole. As I weigh the options, the Mortis engine's presence sharpens in my thoughts. It favors the military installation, its energy signatures promising rich sustenance. I do not question its intuition. It is an extension of my will, a perfect fusion of logic and hunger. I issue the orders and the fleet shifts course, accelerating toward the installation. The approach is uneventful, the installation's defenders unaware of the storm descending upon them. My fleet operates under a cloak of necrotic energy, a field that masks our presence from standard human sensors. From the bridge I observe the target, a sprawling station suspended precariously within the gravitational pull of the black hole. It is a relic from an earlier age, its architecture crude and utilitarian, its design focused on survival rather than elegance. I feel only disdain as I study it, my thoughts already anticipating its destruction. The Mortis engine armada emerges from its shroud with the inevitability of a predator closing in for the kill. My ships unleash a coordinated barrage of necrotic lances, piercing the station's shields and severing its primary power core. The station's defenders scramble to respond, but they are woefully unprepared. Their fleet, a motley collection of outdated frigates and corvettes, moves to intercept us, their formation chaotic and disorganized. I do not permit them the luxury of retreat. As my fleet advances, the Mortis engine's influence spreads, reanimating the wreckage of their fallen ships. Hulls, shattered by our initial assault, are stitched together with necrotic energy, their systems reignited to serve my will. The defenders falter as they realize the nature of their enemy, their fear hanging heavy even in the vast isolation of space. I can feel their terror as though it were a tangible force, a chaotic ripple against the calm tide of my armada. The battle concludes swiftly with the station and its defenders lying in ruins. I oversee the aftermath from the bridge as the Mortis engine consumes the energy of the fallen. The reanimated fleet swells further, its numbers growing with each victory. I permit myself a moment of satisfaction. The campaign is progressing as I envisioned, each step bringing me closer to the galaxy's ultimate purification. But even in this moment of triumph, a ripple of resistance emerges. As my fleet prepares to leave the Velan Expanse, a human vessel, a frigate of unusual design, appears on the fringes of my senses. It does not attack, nor does it attempt to flee. Instead, it lingers just beyond the range of my weapons, observing. Its presence is an anomaly, and I'm not fond of anomalies. I issue orders to intercept the frigate, but it eludes my fleet with remarkable skill. Its pilot is clever, utilizing the region's gravitational anomalies to evade pursuit. My frustration is minimal. The frigate poses no threat. Yet its persistence intrigues me. Each time it reappears, it broadcasts the same signal, a fragment of human communication, encoded with old Alliance protocols. The message is brief and unoriginal. Humanity endures. It is a lie, of course. Humanity does not endure. It flails, it decays, it collapses under the weight of its own chaos. Still, the message lingers in my thoughts longer than I care to admit. As my fleet moves to the next target, the frigate's presence fades, though I know it will return. My attention shifts to the graveyard world of Vecronis 4. It is a fitting location for the next phase of my campaign. Vecronis 4 is rich with derelict ships that once defended this sector. The Mortis engine hungers for these vessels, their dormant systems and latent necrotic energy promising a significant expansion of my armada. When we arrive, the planet's surface stretches out beneath us, a wasteland of metal and shattered hulls. I descend to the surface personally, accompanied by a contingent of reanimated constructs. The Mortis engine's influence spreads across the wreckage, reanimating the long-dead vessels and binding them to my will. The process is seamless as the derelict fleet rises once more. But as I prepare to depart, the anomaly returns. The human frigate emerges from the shadows, accompanied by a small fleet of defenders. They are a pitiful force, their ships battered and outmatched, yet their presence is unexpected. At their head is a vessel of distinct design, its hull marked with the insignia of an old Alliance admiralty. I recognize it immediately, the resolute flagship of Admiral Kev. Krev's voice travels across the void, a relic of an outdated communication system. Archmagos Karex, he begins, his tone defiant. I have studied your methods, your philosophy. You see yourself as inevitable, as the embodiment of order. But you are wrong. Humanity is chaos, but it is also adaptation, resilience. We are not so easily extinguished. I find his words amusing, though I do not dignify them with a response. Instead, I issue the order to engage. My fleet moves, their necrotic lances slicing through the defenders' ranks. Yet Krev's fleet is not as disorganized as I anticipated. His ships employ unconventional tactics, using the gravitational anomalies of Vecronis 4's orbit to their advantage. They evade my strikes, their maneuvers unpredictable yet effective. I study Krev with growing curiosity. His leadership is an anomaly, his strategies an outlier in the otherwise chaotic patterns of human resistance. He is not a fool, nor is he blinded by the arrogance of his kind. He fights with purpose, with a clarity that borders on understanding. I consider sparing him, if only to analyze the depths of his defiance. But such indulgences are unnecessary. My fleet overwhelms his defenders, reanimating their wreckage to turn against them. Krev's forces crumble, his ships reduced to drifting wreckage. Yet the Resolute escapes, retreating into the gravitational shadows of Vecronis 4. I do not pursue. Krev is an anomaly, yes, but he is also irrelevant. His resistance, no matter how inspired, is doomed to fail. As I ascend to the bridge of the Graveheart, I reflect on the events of Vecronis 4. The campaign progresses, the Armada growing stronger with each victory. I focus on the next phase of the campaign, the next target to be claimed. The galaxy's purification is far from complete, and I am its instrument. There is work to be done. Vorar Prime revealed itself as I had expected, a defiant jewel set amid the fractured crown of a dying civilization. From the bridge, I studied its orbital defenses and planetary cities, each a monument to the arrogance of the living. This was the beating heart of the human alliance, or what remained of it. Their attempts at unity, hastily cobbled together after centuries of infighting, were pitiful. Yet the planet bristled with weaponry and determination, its defenders arrayed as though their chaos could somehow repel my precision. Vorar Prime was a nexus of energy, its population a reservoir of souls waiting to be freed. I could feel the tug of their collective presence, millions of lives straining against the confines of their fragile bodies. The thought of their transformation brought a calm satisfaction. Order would take root here, even as the structures of their civilization crumbled. My fleet advanced in silence, cloaked by the wreckage of the systems we had already claimed. The defenders, blind to the inevitability descending upon them, scanned for threats along the usual attack vectors. Their formations were predictable, their strategies stale. I deployed my fleet, positioning it within the wreckage fields to mask our presence until the moment of strike. The planetary bombardment began with a single volley, a concentrated pulse of necrotic energy that swept through Vorar Prime's orbital infrastructure. Its network of satellites and defense platforms disintegrated in an instant, their fragments drawn into the planet's atmosphere like a meteor shower of ruin. The defenders scrambled to respond, their panic a ripple of noise against the serene silence of my fleet. As my ships moved to annihilate the remaining orbital defenses, I turned my attention to the ground invasion. Vorar Prime's cities, though expansive, were poorly connected. Their disunity mirrored that of their inhabitants, each district an isolated node, vulnerable to calculated strikes. My reanimated forces began their descent, thousands of constructs hurtling through the atmosphere in an unholy rain. I followed them, descending within the protective cradle of my command transport, eager to oversee the battle personally. The transport touched down amid the rubble of a shattered suburb, its landing crushing what little remained of a residential zone that had been obliterated during the bombardment. I stepped onto the surface, the metallic echo of my footfalls cutting through the faint cries of survivors still clinging to their doomed lives. My constructs moved in perfect synchronization, a tide of flesh and bone melded with necrotic machinery. Their silence was unnerving, even to me, a reminder of the perfection I had achieved. The first resistance met us in the ruins of a public square. Human soldiers, their uniforms tattered and their weapons ill-maintained, had formed a barricade of wreckage and abandoned vehicles. They fired as my forces approached, their projectiles sparking uselessly against the reinforced plating of the constructs. I observed their faces through the haze of battle, reading their desperation, their hatred, their fear. To them, I was death incarnate, a figure of inevitability, cloaked in robes of dark alloy and flanked by a tide of the unyielding dead. My constructs advanced. They smashed through the barricades with ease, scattering the defenders like leaves before a storm. The humans fought fiercely, but their resistance was futile. As their numbers dwindled, I raised my staff, its necrotic energy radiating outward in a pulse that tore the remaining soldiers from their bodies. Their souls, vibrant and chaotic, were drawn into the Mortis engine's grasp, their energies repurposed to fuel the reanimation of their fallen comrades. The newly reanimated soldiers turned on their former allies without hesitation. Their movements were stiff but efficient, their once chaotic emotions stripped away. I watched as the defenders faltered, their ranks collapsing as they were overwhelmed not only by my constructs but by the twisted forms of their former brothers-in-arms. The square fell silent, the last echoes of gunfire replaced by the necrotic energy coursing through the air. I moved through the aftermath, observing the efficiency of the operation. My constructs were already advancing toward the next objective. I paused near a collapsed fountain, its water stained with blood and rubble. A lone soldier, barely clinging to life, reached out toward me, his eyes wide with terror and pleading. "Why?" he croaked. I regarded him for a moment, calculating whether his words warranted a response. "Because chaos must be silenced," I said finally. With a flick of my staff, his soul was torn from his body, his energy dissipating into the Mortis engine's growing reservoir. The battle spread across the city, my forces moving to dismantle the remaining resistance. Each encounter followed the same pattern. The defenders would form a barricade or attempt an ambush, only to be crushed by the overwhelming might of my constructs. The living, as always, underestimated the power of inevitability. Their need for rest, for sustenance, for morale. They were weaknesses I exploited with ease. My forces advanced, striking at their supply lines and communication hubs, severing their lifelines one by one. In the industrial district, the humans made their most desperate stand. The factories and warehouses provided them with a natural fortress, their narrow corridors and reinforced walls forcing my constructs into close-quarters combat. I observed the battle from an elevated position, my staff glowing as I directed my forces. The defenders fought with admirable tenacity, their improvised defenses slowing my advance, yet their efforts only delayed the inevitable. I descended into the fray, my presence a beacon of death that broke the defenders' resolve. My constructs flanked the human positions, their reanimated forms tearing through steel and flesh with equal ease. I raised my staff once more, its energy coursing outward in a wave that immobilized the defenders. They fell to their knees, their weapons clattering to the ground as their souls were ripped from their bodies. The Mortis engine absorbed them eagerly, its hunger insatiable. As the final defender fell, I moved through the industrial district, my constructs following in silent formation. The air was dense with smoke and ash, the traces of human activity left in decay. I reached the central factory, its massive machinery still operational despite the chaos around it. A human officer, his uniform scorched and his face bloodied, emerged from the shadows, a detonator clutched in his trembling hand. "This ends here," he said, his voice shaking with defiance and despair. "You won't take this city. You won't take us." I regarded him calmly, my staff glowing as I prepared to intervene. "Your actions are meaningless," I said. "Destruction cannot halt inevitability. It can only delay it." He pressed the detonator, and the factory erupted in a blinding explosion. The shockwave tore through the district, collapsing structures and scattering rubble. My constructs shielded me from the worst of the blast, their necrotic plating absorbing the impact. As the smoke lifted, I moved ahead, unscathed. The officer's body lay broken amid the wreckage, his defiance extinguished. The destruction of the factory was a minor inconvenience. My forces regrouped quickly, their synchronization undisturbed by the chaos around them. The remaining defenders fled, their will to fight shattered. I allowed them no reprieve. My constructs pursued them through the city's ruins, reanimating the fallen to bolster their ranks. The tide of death swept through Vorar Prime, leaving no corner untouched. As the sun set over the smoldering city, I stood atop a ruined tower, surveying the devastation. The city was mine, its defenders reduced to ash and servitude. The Human Alliance, their so-called bastion of hope, had crumbled beneath the weight of inevitability. I reflected on the futility of their resistance, their final moments embodying the chaos that defined their existence. They had fought not for victory, but for the illusion of defiance, a fleeting spark of rebellion against the tide of order. Yet even that spark had been extinguished, its embers consumed. Vorar Prime had fallen, its screams absorbed into the growing quiet of my campaign. Yet the galaxy was vast, and silence would not come easily. The remnants of humanity's defiance still lingered, their fractured fleets retreating into the shadows. Among those remnants, whispers of a final rally reached me, a desperate gathering in the depths of the Draconis abyss. They had chosen their ground well, a labyrinth of treacherous anomalies and devouring voids. But no refuge, no matter how chaotic, could shield them from inevitability. My gaze shifted from the stars to the abyss, where humanity's last hope awaited its end. The Draconis abyss was a place where light itself seemed reluctant to linger. Vast and ancient, the system stretched like a gaping wound in the fabric of the galaxy, its black holes churning with gravitational hunger. Fractured asteroid fields spiraled endlessly through its void, colliding in slow, silent violence. Humanity's final defenders gathered here, driven by nothing more than desperation. They sought refuge in chaos, believing it would shield them from inevitability. It was a flawed strategy, one I intended to exploit. From the bridge, I gazed upon the abyssal expanse. My fleet had gathered around me, a silent congregation of necrotic vessels that thrummed with latent power. This system, with its treacherous terrain and fragile hope, would serve as humanity's grave. I could feel the finality of it settling over the battlefield even before the first shots were fired. The Human Alliance had assembled a fleet, a patchwork force of aging battleships, repurposed cargo vessels, and a few newer frigates. They were an ill-fitting mosaic of desperation and defiance, clustered together in a defensive formation that bristled with weaponry. At their center, I recognized the Resolute. Admiral Krev's flagship was battered but defiant, its hull scarred from countless battles. Krev had chosen his ground well. The system's gravitational anomalies made conventional tactics risky, forcing my fleet to move with caution. But I was no stranger to complexity. Where others saw obstacles, I saw opportunity. My armada advanced methodically, weaving through the shifting fields of wreckage and black hole currents with a precision that only the dead could achieve. The human sensors must have picked up my approach long before I emerged from the shadows, yet they held their positions, waiting for the inevitable. As my fleet reached optimal range, I hailed Krev. His response came quickly. "You've taken so much from us, Karex," he said, his words carrying a weight that no defiance could hide. "But you won't take this. Not today." I regarded his defiance with the same detached curiosity I had felt at Vacronis IV. "Your resistance is not noble, Admiral," I replied, my voice reverberating through the ship's systems. "It is entropy prolonging its inevitable dissolution. Surrender your forces and I may yet grant you the peace of unity." Krev's response was a burst of static, followed by silence. Then his fleet moved. The humans struck first, their ships breaking formation and surging toward my armada in a coordinated assault. It was a maneuver born of desperation, relying on surprise and overwhelming firepower to cripple my fleet before I could fully deploy. Their tactics were bold, reckless, and entirely predictable. I allowed them to close the distance, observing their movements. When they were within range, I unleashed the Armada's full might. Necrotic lances carved through the void, slicing through the humans' forward ships with devastating accuracy. The vessels exploded in bursts of light and rubble, their fragments scattering into the gravitational currents. Yet the humans pressed on, their rear lines maneuvering to flank my forces. It was a futile gesture. My fleet, unburdened by the limitations of the living, adapted. Reanimated ships moved to intercept the flanking forces, their necrotic firepower overwhelming the humans' disorganized assault. The battlefield became a graveyard of drifting wreckage and flashing energy. Each human vessel that fell was absorbed into the Mortis engine's influence, its ruins reanimated to serve my will. The dead turned against their comrades, their movements synchronized. Yet Krev's flagship held its ground, its weapons blazing as it coordinated the humans' faltering resistance. As the battle raged in the void, I turned my attention to the system's central anomaly, the Draconis Abyss itself. The largest of the black holes churned at the system's core, its gravitational pull distorting space and time. I saw its potential immediately. If harnessed correctly, it could amplify the power of the Death Pulse catalyst, my ultimate weapon. The humans' final stand would become a singularity of death, their souls consumed and transformed into pure energy for the Mortis engine. I issued the order, and the Death Pulse catalyst began its activation sequence. The weapon, a massive construct housed within the Graveheart, radiated necrotic energy as its systems powered on. The Mortis engine resonated in harmony, its hunger swelling as the weapon prepared to unleash its devastating payload. The humans must have detected the energy spike, for their fleet's movements became frantic. They advanced toward the Graveheart, desperate to stop the weapon before it could fire. Krev's voice cut through the chaos, his transmission laced with urgency. "You're not a god, Karex," he said. "You're a machine wearing the skin of death, and like all machines, you can be broken." I did not respond. His words were meaningless, a desperate attempt to provoke doubt where none existed. The Death Pulse catalyst would fire, and his resistance would end. But Krev was not finished. As his fleet fought to hold the line, he launched a boarding assault. Small strike craft, shielded against my fleet's defenses, darted through the void and latched onto the Graveheart. Their occupants, a mix of human soldiers and demolition teams, breached the ship's outer hull, seeking to disrupt the Death Pulse catalyst's activation. I allowed myself a moment of amusement at their audacity. Did they truly believe their chaotic incursions could halt the inevitable? I descended into the ship's lower decks. where the human strike teams were making their advance. The corridors were dark and silent, the ship's interior a labyrinth of Gothic architecture and necrotic machinery. My constructs moved through the shadows, intercepting the humans. Yet the humans fought fiercely, their desperation driving them to acts of reckless bravery. They detonated charges to collapse sections of the corridor, sacrificing themselves to slow my forces. I reached the central chamber where the Death Pulse Catalyst's core was housed. A strike team had breached its outer defenses, their leader a grizzled officer who barked orders to his comrades. They worked quickly, planting charges along the core's support struts in a last-ditch effort to disable the weapon. I observed them for a moment, my presence concealed by the shadows. Their movements were chaotic, their emotions raw. They were the antithesis of my constructs, their inefficiency a glaring flaw. And yet, there was something compelling in their defiance. I stepped into the chamber, my staff glowing with necrotic energy. The humans froze as they saw me, their weapons raised, but their hands trembling. "You cannot stop this," I said, my voice reverberating through the chamber. "Your actions are the thrashings of a dying beast, futile and meaningless." The officer leveled his weapon at me. "Meaningless," he spat. "We're fighting for the only thing that matters. Life." I raised my staff, unleashing a wave of necrotic energy that swept through the chamber. The humans fell, their souls ripped from their bodies and drawn into the Mortis engine's grasp. Their corpses rose moments later, their eyes glowing with unholy light as they turned to join my constructs. The charges they had planted were deactivated, their efforts undone. As I returned to the bridge, the Death Pulse Catalyst reached full power. The humans' fleet was in disarray, their remaining ships falling back toward the abyss in a desperate attempt to regroup. Krev's flagship held its position, its weapons blazing as it covered the retreat. I could feel his defiance even across the void, a final act of resistance against the inevitable. The Death Pulse Catalyst fired. The weapon's necrotic pulse surged outward, its energy amplified by the black hole's gravitational field. The humans' fleet disintegrated in an instant, their ships consumed by the weapon's destructive power. The black hole churned, its gravitational force growing as it devoured what was left of the battle. The souls of the fallen were drawn into the Mortis engine, their energies fueling its insatiable hunger. As the battlefield fell silent, I turned my gaze to the Resolute. Krev's flagship was crippled, its hull scarred and its systems failing. Yet it remained intact, its defiance unbroken. I hailed him one final time, curious to hear his last words. "You've won," Krev said, his voice weary but resolute. "But you haven't beaten us. Humanity will endure, Karex. Not because of strength, but because of something you'll never understand." I regarded him for a moment, his defiance both admirable and pitiful. "Humanity endures only as a lesson," I replied. "A reminder of the chaos that must be silenced. Your time has ended, Admiral." The Resolute was consumed by the black hole, its final moments a flicker of light against the darkness. The galaxy was silent. The Mortis engine's hunger had been sated, its power unmatched. Humanity's resistance had been extinguished, its chaos replaced by the order of death. Yet as I stood on the bridge, gazing into the void, I felt no triumph. The silence was absolute, unbroken by opposition or defiance. It was perfect, and it was empty. I turned my gaze to the stars. The galaxy was mine, but the question lingered. What purpose remained for a force that could not be challenged? I dismissed the thought, vowing to maintain the order I had created. Chaos would not return. The galaxy would remain silent, even if I had to patrol its endless void for eternity. The Mortis engine stirred again, and I moved forward. There was work to be done,